Hello, hello, lovely to have you here. In today's video, I want to talk a bit about rebirth, about taking rebirth ideas as metaphorical or symbolic. Now, it always makes me somewhat nervous to deal with rebirth on these videos because I know that it's an arena of argument and dispute, and a lot of people have very strong views on this, clinging to views of one kind or another, and I don't want to really feed into that. However, I do want to make a little bit of space here. Because a number of us, we do find certain traditional Buddhist ideas to be really resonant with possibility, with great insight and truth to them, but we don't want to necessarily take them literally. Now, to be perfectly honest and perfectly fair, in traditional Buddhism, rebirth is taken literally, along with their associated ideas of different realms of existence, such as heavens or hells. And indeed, to all evidence, the Buddha himself took these ideas literally and described them as such. And I think we have to be clear about that. Now, in early Buddhism, rebirth is not a continuation of a persisting thing, because in Buddhism, there are no such things that persist over time. All things are always in a process of changing. However, what rebirth is a continuation of a kind of a causal process from lifetime to lifetime, based on karmic seeds that have been laid down in the past. I've done videos about this. I'll leave links to videos down below in the notes if you want to know more about sort of the traditional picture that we get about rebirth in Buddhism. However, that said, there are different viewpoints within traditional Buddhism about how rebirth works. To take one example, in certain of the Theravada, people in the Theravada school take rebirth to be instantaneous, between lifetime and lifetime, whereas other schools believe that there is something of a gap between lifetimes. In Tibetan Buddhism, this is known as the bardo. There's a time between one life and the next that we can work with in various ways. So again, there are controversies. Also, it is true that some Buddhist teachers, such as Bhikkhu Brahmali, claim that in order to be a true Buddhist, you have to believe in literal rebirth. That if you do not believe in literal rebirth, that you are not a quote-unquote true Buddhist. However, there are other Buddhists who either do not believe in a literal understanding of rebirth, or who don't believe that such a belief is really particularly relevant to the path. That is, Buddhists such as Nishijima Roshi, Brad Warner, Jason Quinn, Gil Fronsdale, Bhikkhu Buddhadasa, B.R. Ambedkar, Stephen Batchelor, many others. Now, some of these people come from a Zen background that looks sort of askance on any kind of conceptual ideas and views in general, and so looks at rebirth also from that same sort of skeptical point of view. Others of us also come from what we might term a kind of a secular background, where a secular background is one that privileges rational inquiry and evidence over what we might term religious faith. That is, when it comes to religious claims that are put forward, we want to know, can we see them directly for ourselves as true? Or if not, is there sufficient evidence that we have that can be verifiable evidence that these claims are true? And when it comes to rebirth, at least I personally cannot verify these things directly, these claims directly, and I don't find evidence that I find verifiable out there that rebirth is true. Now, other people will disagree, that's perfectly fine, but at least I'm speaking from my own point of view. And even when it comes to my own direct experience, I'm aware of my own mind's tendency to hallucinate or confabulate in certain contexts. So even my own direct evidence might not be enough to convince me when I'm sort of outside of that state of where I might experience it, to know whether what I experienced was real or not. There are a lot of questions here. So taking this approach to the Buddhist Dharma, one that is compatible with, for example, what the Buddha had to say to the Kalamas in one early sutta, still does leave the field open to us to understand rebirth as a metaphorical or symbolic claim. And this understanding of rebirth is perhaps first put forward in the Abhidhamma Vibhanga, which is what a text that Analayo believes is perhaps the oldest, or at least one of the oldest, books in the Abhidhamma. The Abhidhamma being a series of commentaries, if you like, on the Buddhist suttas and what the Buddha had to say, trying to compile his views. And again, in one place in this Abhidhamma, in one of the books of the Abhidhamma, a view is put of rebirth that is quite similar to this, that rebirth is understood, we might say metaphorically, as an interpretation of our moment-by-moment mental life through an ordinary lifetime. That we are continually dying and being reborn every moment. So one day, perhaps, we're mired in darkness, we're depressed, and then perhaps we have a good night's sleep, we talk to the right person, we do exercise, we do meditation, and suddenly the world brightens. Our life changes. We get a new job, we have a new relationship, we take up a new hobby. A lot of things can change in our lives from day to day and moment to moment, and they may feel to us like new births, metaphorically like a rebirth of a kind. Over longer periods, our ideas of ourselves may change pretty completely. When I was younger, I had very different ideas, I clung to very different views, I had very different interests, I wanted to live in very different places. All these things, perhaps almost all of my views and all of my ideas changed over this period of time. Now, these are broad changes. These are changes that really get at who we think we are, in a sense. I mean, what we want to do with our lives, where we want to live, where we want to be, who we want to be with. But there are, of course, more subtle changes, again, from moment to moment that we perhaps overlook, but all of these can be thought of as deaths and rebirths, moment by moment. This is one of the things that shows to us that we're not literally identical over time, this notion of non-self, that the self, that who we are, that who we think of ourselves as being, is always changing. And we can indeed witness this process when we're in meditation. This is indeed one of the benefits of having a long meditation practice, is over a long period of time, if we reflect back, we can understand and see the changes that have gone on, the periods in our lives where we were perhaps obsessed with some particular thing that is completely out of our lives now. How these obsessions and worries and concerns and fears and sadness and happiness, how they all come and go like clouds in a sky. And how the things that we think of as really who we are just ideas that pass. And these processes of dying in our lives all the time can be painful. Giving up past homes, past relationships, past jobs, past ideals. Oftentimes when we're young, we have these enormous ideals, and when we get to, let's say, more a mature middle age, we see through those ideals. We see that those ideals were not really achievable in certain ways. That can be troubling, that can be depressing, that can sadden us and create suffering in our lives. In the last year, my wife and I have moved several times because we had a house fire. There have been enormous changes, and these changes can be difficult. These changes can involve suffering. And so seeing life as intimately incorporating death and rebirth can make us open to seeing the same in other people, can make us open to compassion for others and understanding how they themselves are going through these processes of difficult processes of death and rebirth all the time. We're all navigating this difficult world, this impermanent world, with an impermanent self, with a self that is always dying and being reborn in a world that is always, in a certain sense, decaying and being reborn. Not just, of course, specifically every year as as perhaps spring arises, if you're in the right part of the world for that, we see that these cycles occur vividly in front of us, but they occur on a more micro scale every second as things change, as things go away and new things arise. And even at our physical death, there is a symbolic sense to be made of rebirth, as our actions, for good or for ill, persist beyond us into the world that our children and other people inherit. They will have to deal with the good things that we've done as well as the bad. And if we practice compassion and kindness in this life to others around us, our effects will then reverberate into that future. If we act in skillful ways, we'll leave a better place for the people who come after us. And that's, of course, true at our physical death, but it's also true during our lives in the sense that we may directly impact only a small group of people around us, our family, our friends, the people that we see regularly, but they themselves, by having interacted with us, will then interact with other people in a better way if we can be skillful with them. So in that sense, our beneficial actions reverberate into the world in a sort of a ripple fashion outside of the part of the world that we're directly aware of. And this is the way that our effects persist beyond us, again, in a way that rebirth is kind of symbolic of. We can consider the effects of such people as Martin Luther King or Nelson Mandela, Fred Rogers, Mr. Rogers, Carl Sagan, or of course the Buddha himself. People who lived exemplary lives in one way or another. They may not have been perfect people, but in any event were good enough to have left a posterity to make the world a better place. And in that sense, their actions have for certain outlived them. And of course, the rest of us may not be at their level, but even doing small things that benefit those around us can indeed have a beneficial effect. And so understanding the world in this way can help us to be better people. Seeing rebirth as metaphorical can also help us jettison some of the associations of rebirth that are less skillful. For example, the aspects of rebirth that seem to touch on, let's say, blaming the victim mentality. This is something in particular that worried B.R. Ambedkar, the great Indian statesman and polymath, because he was concerned this idea of rebirth might tend to absolve the powerful of the effects of injustice by essentially claiming that those who were downtrodden, those who were less successful in life, deserved their lack of success because of something they had done in a prior lifetime. Examples of this we can actually go back and find in the early suttas, ideas such as that if you kill somebody in one lifetime, you're going to have a short lifetime in the next life to come. There are all kinds of statements like this in some early suttas, associating bad lives with what you might have done in a prior lifetime. And some people indeed do take these, I think, unskillfully to heart, and so they'll see somebody who is, let's say, had a short life, had an unsuccessful life, had a life of great hardship, and believe or claim that they must have that because of something bad they had done in a prior lifetime. Now, of course, this is not the proper way to approach such people, even on a traditional understanding. That is, even on a traditional understanding of rebirth, the way we should approach people who are in positions of suffering is through compassion and kindness and not through blame. We should also approach them, as the Buddha says, by understanding that these laws of karma are unknowable, basically, that it will drive us crazy to try to understand the laws of karma. So I do want to point out that again, we even on traditional understanding, we should not be thinking in those ways. Nevertheless, looking at rebirth as simply a metaphor, understanding it as a metaphor, as metaphorical, can help some of us to release a hold around these kinds of unskillful views of rebirth. That said, I think it's important also to acknowledge the significance that many Buddhists hold to a traditional view of literal rebirth. For many, the fact of the world is one of a beginningless round of these rebirths, and that the whole idea of the Buddhist Dharma, the whole idea of the Buddhist path, is to provide us an escape from that beginningless cycle, and that without, therefore, a literal view of rebirth, the whole Buddhist path makes no sense to them. And that is indeed a popular way of understanding the Dharma. And it's one that indeed the Buddha himself expressed, that the point of the path was to escape the beginningless round of literal rebirths. Also, in one early sutta, a sutta that is without parallel in other languages, so it's not clear exactly how early it is, but in any event, in one sutta, the Buddha does seem to claim that the view of rebirth is particularly important because it can help us to behave ethically. That is, if we understand the world in terms of a literal rebirth, a karmically conditioned literal rebirth, we're more likely to act skillfully because we're going to be concerned that if we don't act skillfully, in a future lifetime we're going to suffer for it. We might suffer for it. And so, to reiterate, if you find a literal view of rebirth useful to you, if you find it compelling, then by all means continue with that view. I'm not trying to argue you out of it. Indeed, a literal view of rebirth is quite compatible with the position that I'm putting forward here. That is to say, literal rebirth may be true, and also rebirth may be a very useful metaphor or symbolic viewpoint to take of our moment-by-moment lifetime within this very life. So my goal here is not to dismiss the literalist view, but rather to provide an alternative perspective that may be available or open to a wider audience of people who could potentially benefit from many of the Buddha's this life practices. Because in any case, I think we all agree that life often seems unsatisfactory, and that the suffering in life ought to be assuaged. We also may agree that the deepest source, the most intractable source of suffering in our lives is our tendency to cling and to crave things that we cannot have. In particular, permanence or control that is impossible to get. And we also may agree that suffering can indeed be assuaged. And further, that there is a method that we can use to help assuage that suffering, that includes being kind to one another, being ethical, behaving in the right way, that includes calming meditation and mindfulness, that includes a practice of wisdom. To that end, I think it would be beneficial for us to have an ongoing dialogue between all of the various approaches to the Buddhist Dharma, both old and new. And I hope you will continue that dialogue in the comments below and elsewhere. So to summarize here, there are a range of Buddhist understandings of rebirth and of how rebirth works. But one way that is gaining some currency nowadays is to see rebirth as symbolic of the processes, this ongoing processes that are always changing, the relations between ourselves that are always changing, and a world that is ever changing. And of metaphorical, of the karmic effects that we can leave to the world after our literal passing. Contemplating rebirth in this way can help us understand the Buddha's teachings around non-self, around the self as a changing process, as well as help understand the world in a more compassionate, kind way. So I would encourage you to reflect upon your own conception of rebirth, whatever it happens to be, and of how that conception of rebirth, how that view of rebirth might become useful to you in your practice. That said, I want to leave you with a quote from the Buddha, one that was suggested in a recent essay by Gil Fronsdale. And in this, the Buddha is discussing the way that unskillful mental states can arise in us when we pay improper attention to certain kinds of subjects. So here's what the Buddha said. This is how they attend improperly. Did I exist in the past? Did I not exist in the past? What was I in the past? How was I in the past? After being what did I become in the past? Will I exist in the future? Will I not exist in the future? What will I be in the future? How will I be in the future? After being what will I become in the future? Or they're undecided about the present. Thus, am I? Am I not? What am I? How am I? This sentient being, where did it come from and where will it go? So at the end of the day, the Buddha is telling us, obsessions over who we are through time, fixed views on who we must be through time, are a result of our clinging to views of a self, and that produces its own problems. Now, I've done a past video on the history of this idea of rebirth within Buddhism and around the world, and I'll leave a link to that video up here on the screen if you haven't seen it or would like to take another look. If you're getting something out of these videos, please consider taking a look at my Patreon page as well. It's linked down below in the notes and up here on the screen, and see if you want to help support the channel and the work that we're all doing here. Thanks so much, and we'll catch you on the next video, and meanwhile, all of you, be well.